Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're just waiting for a few more folks to join and get settled in. Okay, everyone, let's begin. Welcome all to this FP Insider conference call on how the coronavirus pandemic is affecting energy markets. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. Before we get into the substance of the call, I want to make just a few housekeeping notes. In a second, I'm going to introduce our guest speakers, Helima and Jason, and ask them some questions. I'll then open up the floor to everyone else who's called in so you can ask questions as well. And here's how that's going to work. For those of you who have joined us using Zoom, there should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's just to the right of the center on my monitor. Whenever you want to ask a question, just hit that button. It will open a window where you can type in your question, and you can send these in at any time starting now. They'll come to me and then I'll read them aloud during the Q&A portion. For those of us who are joining us by phone, your best bet is to email us your questions at web@foreignpolicy.com. Again, you can start doing that right now if you'd like. We just make one request, which is in either case, when you do send us a question, please be sure to provide your name, your organization, and the city and country from which you're joining us. Okay, now for the substance of the call. It's now been about 4 weeks since the coronavirus lockdown started here in the Northeast. As you can see, the closure of all barbershops is hitting some of us harder than it is others. Since the crisis began, the global economy has, of course, progressively shut down, and with it, energy prices have gone into free fall. For about a month now, Russia and Saudi Arabia have also been locked into a bitter and Pyrrhic price war. At least until yesterday, a ceasefire in that war seemed elusive, and the mixed signals coming from the White House only confused participants in the markets even more. Just about the only good news I can say about all of this is that we have two truly extraordinary world-class energy experts on the call with us today to help us sort it all out. And I'm proud to say that they both happen to be old friends of mine, although that had nothing to do with our choosing them, I assure you. Helima Croft is Managing Director and the Global Markets Head of Commodity Strategy at RBC Capital Markets. She's also a former CIA analyst. Jason Bordoff is Founding Director of the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia. He was also a special assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for Energy and Climate Change at the National Security Council. Okay, here we go. There's a question for both of you. So Saudi and Russia met yesterday at the OPEC Plus meeting along with the other members. And the G20 energy meetings, which includes the two of them as well as the United States, are meeting now. And from what I understand, that meeting has gone into overtime. First, I want you to start by giving us a little background on the dispute itself. What are the real reasons and motivations for this Saudi-Russian price war? Helima, why don't you start?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things to sort of bear in mind is that if we go back to the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, there was a lot of uncertainty initially about what the demand impact on oil would be from the crisis. And in early February, Saudi Arabia's oil minister, His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, he really wanted to organize an emergency OPEC meeting to do a very deep cut. I mean, he saw the crisis as potentially worse than the 08-09 financial crisis, and he wanted OPEC to do, a 1 million barrel a day cut in the beginning of February. The Russians, who have been a co-partner of OPEC since 2016, were a little more sanguine about the demand impact. They essentially said, too soon to tell what the demand impact is going to be, have no emergency meeting, let's wait for more information. And so by the time we got to the March 6th meeting day in Vienna, you had a real sort of struggle between Saudi Arabia and OPEC over what the magnitude of the crisis should be and what should be the corrective action. And the Russians at that meeting blocked the attempt of OPEC Plus, this big producer organization, to do an additional 1.5 million barrel a day production cut on top of the 2.1 million that they were already doing from December. And then the meeting essentially fell apart, and the Russian oil minister left the meeting and essentially said, every producer for themselves on April 1. The Saudis the next day slashed their official selling prices, and that's when the oil price war commenced. And then Saudi subsequently announced plans to ramp up output to levels we had never seen before, 12.3 million barrels a day. Other key OPEC producers announced plans to ramp up output. And that was the big sort of flood of oil onto the market in the midst of an unprecedented demand crash. So that's how we got to the point we are right now. The Saudis have said, we will cut, we would like a big cut, we want all producers involved in the cut, but the Russians have to be there. And from the Russian perspective, their point of view, not only was that they did not know what the demand impact was going to be in March, but they also said the burden of adjustment should be on the high cost producers. It should be US shale producers that shut in first. They were tired of a situation where the OPEC countries, Russia cut production, and the US would grow production. There was also some discontent about the sanctions policy of the US, that Russian energy corporates have been sanctioned repeatedly during this era of American energy abundance. So I think that's how everything came to a head. And now what we're waiting to see is how large a cut will Russia and Saudi Arabia do? They're talking about a 10 million barrel a day production cut. We're still waiting to see whether Mexico will endorse it. And then the question is, what will the contribution of countries that are outside of this framework be? What will the US do? What will Canada do? What will Norway do? Will we get to something around 15 million barrels a day? We're waiting for the G20 decision, but that's when we'll have some clarification on the size of the cut.
Jason, what do you think the key motivation was here? I mean, how much of it with the Saudis and the Russians was about price support, and how much of it was about really wanting to force US shale out of the game?
Yeah, I just want to keep listening to Helima because I learned so much. That was great. And I agree with everything she said. I mean, just to put it in context, there was this collapse in the talks. People were surprised by the extent to which the Saudis the very next day said, well, if nobody wants to cut, we're going to flood the market and put a ton more crude on the market. But given how things have evolved over the last month, we should recognize that the supply increase, this price war, is a small piece of what is causing the oil price collapse, which is an unprecedented, not even the Great Depression. Did we see something like a 25 million barrel a day drop in oil demand in 1 month, which is what we saw this month because of the coronavirus, the necessary public health response, which is to basically put our economy on hold. So that's the challenge we're dealing with. I think the original motivation for OPEC plus cooperation and also for the unwillingness to cut production in March, this is, Foreign Policy Magazine, had a lot to do with geopolitics, not just oil market fundamentals. As Helima said, there was discontent in Moscow, not only with the fact that production cuts might prop up less economic shale production, but with sanctions policy in the United States. And the resolution over the last several weeks, as she said, they came together in Vienna yesterday, both seeking an agreement to cut production. That's not what they were saying a few weeks ago. They were saying, we're dug in for the long haul. We're ready to, our economy can survive a year, 2, 3. The Saudis said, it makes all the sense in the world for us to.
What changed? I mean, why did their attitude
And I think a big part of what changed was geopolitics, right? It was both carrot and stick diplomacy led by the United States. It is remarkable, we should remember, that the US would do that in the first place. What the US is doing over the last few weeks is using, again, carrots and sticks to persuade and cajole the Saudis and the Russians to make oil prices higher. It's been a long time since the US has done that. Typically,
right. You wrote for us, it last happened in the Eisenhower administration.
Yeah, well, I think it was, I wrote a foreign policy piece sort of noting the famous trip of George H.W. Bush in 1986 to ask King Fahd to increase, to help increase prices by cutting supply. And that, is a reflection of how dramatically the US energy outlook has changed in the last decade. We're now the largest oil producer in the world. We're on the cusp of being a net exporter. And so it's causing more harm to the economy. It's certainly causing a lot of harm in oil producing states like Texas. And so there was a lot of pressure to get the oil price up. And so that started in Congress with some pretty threatening letters from members of the Senate. And then eventually President Trump getting on the phone with Putin, with Mohammed bin Salman, and saying, we really need your help with this. And, the reason, we should remember, the reason Saudi Arabia is the only country in the world, almost the only country in the world that holds meaningful amounts of oil in reserve to take it off the market or put it back on the market when that is needed. They have a unique ability to manage the market, and that gives them a unique measure of geopolitical influence, which means Washington, D.C. and other capitals call them when the market needs some help in one direction or the other. And that's what they're responding to right now. The last thing I'll say is everything they're doing is still not sufficient to deal with a 20 or 25 million barrel a day demand.
And that's my next question. I mean, A, do you think we're likely to get a real agreement out of yesterday and today that sticks and does the work that it needs to, or will it just be some sort of a face-saving gesture that's too thin and that breaks down? But then the related question is, given the precipitous drop in demand that you both alluded to, can the producers do enough to push prices up to the level that Trump, for example, wants them to be at?
I think the end. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Helima.
Go ahead.
No, I think it's a necessary first step. I mean, the market reacted in a very sort of skeptical way to the announcement of the 10 billion barrel a day cut yesterday. There was a view that, again, not enough. But from our perspective, it's really important to keep this oil in the ground. And when you have a bathtub that is overflowing because you have a clogged drain, because demand isn't there, with people not flying, not driving their cars, the worst thing you can have is to have the tap open. I mean, we have a massive demand crash, but we also have a supply problem as well. And so we need to turn off those taps. Right. We need to be able to bring down inventories, because if they kept going and flooding this market, when we did get some type of recovery, we would still have a wall of inventory that would have to be worked off to get prices higher.
And in fact, I've heard that on a physical level, reservoirs are getting filled already, both on and offshore.
And that is a huge issue, storage.
Places to convince consumers to take some of these oil off their hands because they can't store it anymore.
I mean, my colleague Mike Tran really talks about if this deal happens, the one thing we can do is we can dodge the inventory iceberg. I mean, we're talking about potentially building massive, billion barrels of inventory that would have to be worked off. So now we have to get beyond the COVID-19 crisis. We still have a huge demand issue, but we can potentially be in a better inventory place for the back half of the year and early 2021. So we think it is actually meaningful, but not sufficient to boost prices immediately.
Let me just add one thing to that, which is these cuts will not be sufficient to prevent lots of storage limits from being reached in different parts of the country and different timescales. The agreement doesn't take effect till May 1st. You look into May or into June, we do start to see a lot of these infrastructure problems. But even the cuts that are promised and going to be packaged together, 10 million from OPEC plus yesterday, another 5 million from the G20 today, most of that is being driven by market forces. These are not government decisions to cut production. When you have Russia has agreed to a fairly large production cut, that's because Russia can't place all the barrels it is seeking to sell anyway. There's not enough demand for it. The G20 countries are going to put production numbers on the table that represent the market-driven supply decline. So there's two ways to do what Helima is talking about. One is governments decide to limit how much oil is produced. The other is low prices decide to limit how much oil is produced. And that is a lot of what is happening today. And that's going to continue to happen even with the agreements that came out of OPEC plus yesterday. I don't think that is going to add up to 10 million barrels a day of government mandated production declines on top of what the market otherwise would have delivered.
I have a couple of big picture questions that I want to come back to in a minute, but we've already received a whole bunch of questions on things you've already said, and I want to bring some of those in now. Roberto Dondish from the Stimson Center in Seattle, Washington, asked you, Helima, if you could expand a bit on your reference to Mexico a few minutes ago and how it's proving the spoiler. What's going on there? What's the story?
Yeah, I mean, basically, it looks like we had a done deal yesterday. And there's been a principle that His Royal Highness Prince Abdulaziz has really maintained since he became the oil minister in September. His view is that Saudi Arabia will do more than everybody else because of their role as the central banker of oil, the holder of spare capacity, but everybody has to carry their weight. He does not like free riding. So his position was everybody had to be in on the agreement. And so what Mexico objected to was Mexico was assigned a 400,000 barrel a day production cut. What they essentially did was, for equity, was they used the October 2018 production levels, which was a high watermark for all of these sovereign producers. And they essentially said, we're going to apply a 23% cut to those levels. And the Mexican government essentially said, we're not prepared to take a 400,000 barrel a day cut. We will take a 100,000 barrel a day cut. Now, Mexico, through their hedging program, it's one of the world's largest and most complicated financial transactions. They have hedged a significant portion of their production. So they will receive $49 a barrel, regardless of where prices are. So they have more financial protection for low oil prices. But they essentially said, no 400,000. And then, as the Saudi oil minister said last night, if Mexico's not in, we have no deal. Now, this morning, there was some discussion that Mexico would do 100,000. There was a call between President Trump and López Obrador over the discussion about Mexico's contribution. He indicated the U.S. would kick in an additional 250,000 to Mexico to maybe bring them to 350, but we're still waiting to see whether that will be accepted. And so that is the spoiler at the moment that we're all waiting to get resolved is, will Mexico be there? But again, the Saudi oil minister is, everybody has to participate in equal ways.
We have a question from Canada's oil patch. Kevin Stesick, who's a retail investor in Calgary, wants to know if the proposed cuts are just window dressing. For example, he says, his understanding is that the Saudi cuts are from April levels. Will Saudi cut more than stated in hopes of currying favor from the US? Jason, why don't you take that?
Well, I mean, we have RBC on the phone, so Helima should comment on Canada. I think the baseline they're using is 11 or 11.3, so not the April number of 12 something. So if you look at Saudi's production commitment, it would be 8.5, which is, you know, less than the 9.7 they were doing before the OPEC meeting. Would they go above and beyond that as they did last time to cut additionally? I think the answer is probably yes, if they thought it would have some impact. I mean, the problem now is an extra 500,000 or even 1 million barrels a day is just swamped to such a large degree by the level of the oversupply situation we're talking about it's hard to really move the needle. But
I would just add something to that in terms of the Saudi numbers, because, you know, they have associated gas production, and Saudi has had this whole issue in terms of, you know, domestic energy consumption. And so one of the issues for Saudi Arabia, I think, is that initially they would not want to go below a level around 8.5 million barrels a day because it could impact associated gas production. So not that they wouldn't do it if required, but that is something I think that as a first order, they would want to maintain a floor around 8.5 for associated gas production as we go into summer months.
Jörg Haas, who's with the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Berlin, wants to know if all of this is about global positioning with climate change in the background. His question is, are we seeing the oil producers right now trying to compete to get as big a share of the remaining market as possible now before the inevitable policy responses to the ongoing climate disaster start to kick in? So is this like a last minute shuffling of the chairs before those chairs start getting pulled away?
Who would you like?
Well, Jason, you're nodding.
Yeah.
I don't think that's a meaningful part of the story. I think there's certainly concern in oil producing countries about what the long-term effects of climate policy will be and what that means for oil demand and oil prices. I don't think there's a view that the world's getting off of oil anytime soon, which may well be correct. So I think when you're talking about adjusting a few million barrels a day here or there in production agreements, keeping oil underground or producing a little bit more, when you're taking a very long-term view and have the level of resources that Saudi is, I don't think that's a meaningful driver. I do think the climate impacts of what we're seeing with this historic oil price collapse is an important and interesting one to think about. Obviously, low prices undermine the economics of alternatives like electric vehicles and other things. I think my biggest concern is actually just the driver of the oil price collapse, which is this severe economic downturn and the level of pain we're seeing now. 2 trillion, another trillion in stimulus, even that is not going to be anywhere close to enough with these massive levels of unemployment. And I think history teaches, unfortunately, that the level of policy ambition on environmental issues tends to wane sometimes when there are severe economic strains and people feel stress in their pocketbook. And I think just from the standpoint of where we move forward on climate policy, that's my biggest concern right now.
So do you think this whole episode has proved that all the talk we were hearing until very recently, that the United States had finally achieved energy independence, was just that, was talk and was not grounded in reality? Bethany McLean, the author of Saudi America, has an op-ed in the Times today arguing that the supposed shale revolution was not so much of a revolution after all, because it was propped up by high prices and unsustainable leverage, levels of leverage of debt, which is why we're seeing the collapse that we are now.
I'll take some of that.
Go ahead.
Well, I always say that anytime President Trump has to pick up the phone and call Saudi Arabia, whether it be when he wants more oil on the market, like he did when the US exited the Iranian nuclear deal and prices were rising in the summer of 2018, and he called King Salman and demanded additional barrels, or now when he's calling King Salman and asking for the Saudis to essentially cut production. Every time he has to make that phone call to Riyadh and now to Moscow, undercuts the idea that we are an island, that basically we have all the oil we need and we don't need to depend on Saudi Arabia and now to a certain extent Russia. And so I think that has been, blown up by this. And I think the other issue as well is that, shale production has needed a financial lifeline from OPEC. We've had 3 years of President Trump, members of Congress, threatening to pass this bill called the NOPEC bill, which would declare it a cartel and subject to antitrust legislation. And yet, it's always the shale companies that are waiting for the outcome of OPEC meetings because they put a floor in for prices. And so I think this whole episode has shown the sort of mutual dependence between US E&P companies and the sovereign producers of OPEC.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I agree. I think everyone who kind of spends their time studying energy day to day hates the phrase energy independence, because in an interconnected global energy market, it doesn't really mean anything. The fact that the US went from importing 60% of our oil to being on the cusp of being a net exporter means there's lots of economic and geopolitical benefits that go along with that. But we're still part of a global market, and low prices, still can hurt some parts of the energy sector. And, it's interesting, we were commenting before how part of the reason, the motivation for Russia was their displeasure with sanctions. So just think about the mentality where Putin says, I'm going to try to hurt the United States. Let me do that by lowering the price of oil. That wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. The same way China can threaten in a trade war to put tariffs on US oil or US gas exports. That wasn't a tool they had 10 years ago. So there's this soft underbelly of energy dominance, which is still there. That doesn't mean the shale revolution is not real and is not viable. And I think that was where I would take issue a little bit with what Bethany wrote in the New York Times today. What Helima and I are saying is true, even if the US is the largest oil producer in the world. And I think it is certainly true that there was some meaningful amount of oil production in the US that was being propped up with high yield debt that probably didn't make sense over the last year or two to be producing. And I think once prices recover maybe to $50 or so WTI, the US price, we'll see shale growing something like 300,000 or 400,000 barrels a day, not 1 or 1.5 million barrels a day.
Well, and
that's still a lot of money, right? That's still a pretty meaningful amount.
What impact do you think this is going to have on the US shale patch? Is it going to emerge from this crisis leaner and meaner with less debt to worry about? And what will the inevitable bankruptcies, some of which we're seeing already, and the consolidation mean for the public, for the United States, and for the environment? Jason?
Yeah, so I sort of started, I mean, that was kind of the point I was making was, so I think this is
That's
going
what I want you to follow up on.
This is going to be painful for the shale patch. And so it depends obviously how long this lasts and how low prices go, but maybe a year or two from now, US production is down 1 million barrels a day this year, another million next year. We're falling some meaningful amount. Instead of 1,000 companies, maybe you have 750 or 800 companies. You're going to see companies that were more financially on the brink. You're going to see more consolidation. You're going to see more rationalization. The shale resource is still there, and much of that shale resource is still economic to develop, maybe not at $30 a barrel, but at 45 or 50 or whatever you think that the price is in different places.
And isn't technology lowering that price all the time?
It is. I mean, yes. And so we've seen a lot of that. The question is how much more of that there is to do, but sure, there is some more of that that can come as well. And that's why I think what you're going to see is, as you said, probably a shale sector coming out of this that is more resilient to severe price drops and increases, is growing at a slower rate, but probably is healthier economically because there will be consolidation into companies with stronger balance sheets and less debt.
Yeah, I would add on to that I think it's very important as well when we think about the shale industry going forward. It's been the entry of the international companies, the big majors into the shale plays, the Exxons, the Chevrons. I mean, I think that gives a long-term viability to the U.S. energy story. And I think that is something that was highly appreciated in Riyadh. I mean, I was there right after the OPEC meeting collapsed. And they were basically saying that you can't price out shale with the majors coming in. That shale had become more resilient. And these were companies, particularly the majors, have big balance sheets to develop this in a very rational way. And so again, the resource will be developed. And again, I just think it's very important also which companies are now developing that resource.
And what does this mean for other non-conventional sources of oil and gas, like the pre-salt in Brazil, or the shale fields in Argentina or in China or in Europe, or deep sea, for example? How are they going to be affected?
Go ahead, Helima.
I mean, I think the question, I think there's things that are very unique about the sort of U.S. shale story in terms of the ownership of the land, in terms of things like water resources. Again, things that are going to be higher cost in this price environment, we're not going to see really outside the U.S. A lot of new exploration and production out in these sort of non-conventional plays. And so I think that is something at this period of pretty prolonged, muted prices since 2014, 2015, we're not having a lot of development outside the US. I mean, you have fields like Guyana, but you don't have a lot of new projects in the pipeline coming on.
Mm-hmm. I want to just take a sec to reset, remind everyone you're listening to this FP Insider conference call on the pandemic and energy markets. Remind you that if you want to ask a question, and we invite them, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you're on Zoom, or email them to us at web@foreignpolicy.com if you're joining us by phone. Okay, let me take some more questions now from our callers, our listeners. Nick Sortizo, and we have a similar question from Ahmad Salah, are asking about the economic impact on the GCC, on the Gulf Cooperation Council countries. This is the monarchies in the Arabian Peninsula. And what effect do you think this is going to have on Saudi's big Vision 2030? It's much ballyhooed, so far not very substantiated, move away from oil to new sectors of the economy. It's diversification plan.
I mean, I can start with that. I mean, I think it's a big hit to the finances of these GCC countries. And I think it was they fully understood the implications of taking this move. And so what we're seeing is budgets being slashed across the region, resorting to debt financing to make the math work. I mean, this is going to be a real challenge for these governments. I think in the case of Saudi Arabia, one of the things that Mohammed bin Salman has benefited from has been the social reforms as well. And so when you want to basically say, where have we seen significant progress in areas that are important to young Saudis, it's really been on some of these social reform issues in terms of entertainment, more freedom of movement, relaxation of restrictions on men and women in public places. All of that has given sort of oxygen to young Saudis in terms of the social sphere. Where they've really struggled is attracting foreign direct investment into the country, generation of the new jobs that they're promising. And so this is the challenge for Saudi Arabia and for the GCC is there's still a lot that needs to be done in terms of economic reform, in terms of attracting investment. In some ways, though, this period of low prices may be another catalyst for doubling down on reform efforts. I mean, you talk to people in the United Arab Emirates and they talk about the big reforms that were done, there, and how they saw the 2014, 2015 price collapse as a burning platform to double down on reform. And so I think that will be the interesting thing to look for is, do we see now greater attention to the diversification programs?
Yeah, no, I think that, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jason, please.
No, I don't have much to add. I think that's exactly right. I think, that for several years now, the kingdom has shown it has the ability to borrow. It has shown it has foreign exchange reserves that it can rely on, although those have shrunk since the 2014 oil price collapse, and they need to make investments domestically in order to execute successfully on the Vision 2030 program. And that's constrained in a time when you're cutting budgets and you have such an oil price so much below your break-even fiscal price. I think the concern is even greater in many other oil-producing countries that don't have that ability to borrow, don't have those fiscal buffers. Oil revenue, I think government revenue, oil is 90% of government revenue in Iraq. It's 2/3.
Right, let me stop you there because I want to bring in a question from a caller which relates to that, and I can get you to respond to him. Mark Amuzu, and I want to remind folks, please, to tell us where you are listening to this from. Mark Amuzu asked, what is this going to do to the countries we haven't mentioned very much, that are less well developed, that are generally poorer, and that generate huge amounts of their revenue from crude? What is the way forward for those countries, and how are they being affected, whether it's Algeria or Nigeria or what have you?
Iraq, Angola, yeah, these are countries that are going to be significantly strained by this and don't have the same ability to tap international finance or foreign exchange reserves in order to make it through this period. And so I think,
nor do they have the ability, right, to force change because their reservoirs aren't big enough that they can make market moving changes.
Yeah, and those are the countries where you worry about political instability and you worry about severe economic distress. Especially at a time when some of them are going to be confronting a global pandemic that's going to require the necessary, slowdown in economy, social distancing, public health measures that areas of conflict or poor governance may struggle even before the oil price collapse to handle.
No, I would just add to that. I mean, we had several oil-producing governments fall in the last 12 months because of tremendous social instability and people criticizing the failure of there to be any dividend from oil production. I mean, we saw the government in Algeria collapse. We had the government of, South Sudan. We've had Sudan's governments collapse. We've had, changes in the Iraqi government. We had, massive protests in Iran over economic conditions there. And so I think the real question is, are we going to get potentially a sort of second or third Arab Spring in some of these countries, if the government is seen as not being responsive to citizens? I mean, I think that's going to be the real challenge, is to see what unfolds in those countries. And Jason mentioned the COVID-19 crisis. I mean, we think about a country like Iran reeling under sanctions, again, already experiencing mass social demonstrations in the fall, and then in the wake of the shooting down of the Ukrainian passenger plane, and now allegations that they mishandled and were not forthcoming about the extent of the COVID-19 crisis there. So I would be looking for potential real problems in these less flush, more stressed oil-producing states.
Priya Pujari is asking about the flip side of this equation, the other side of the equation. What does all this mean for the huge consumer countries like China and India?
I think generally, it is interesting to see the G20 come together today and try to handle an oil price collapse, because the G20 is not sort of fit for purpose with trying to prop up oil prices.
Right? Because you have consumer nations and producer nations who have very different interests.
That's exactly right. Now, I think there's a variety of reasons they've come together, and the magnitude and scale of this oil price collapse. I mean, as you said, typically when oil prices fall, that's good for economies. It puts more money in people's pockets. It helps your trade balance because you're importing a lot of your crude, and that can help to prop up more spending in other parts of the economy. The problem now is there is no spending in other parts of the economy. So the idea, even in the United States, when we basically on a net basis, we're importing as much as we're exporting. And so what that means is when you see an oil price collapse like this, there's less oil-related investment, but you have a consumer benefit, and that should offset. It's not really doing that in the US now because consumers can't really spend that benefit. And so I think that's why it's been easier, in my view, to pull consumer countries and importing countries together in the G20, because this is such an extraordinary circumstance. This is not the normal prop up oil prices, but it is sort of a once in a century kind of collapse.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And then one thing I would add is one of the things that we should be watching for in terms of a potential demand recovery is to watch, China's, willingness to now use lower prices to back up the truck and fill up their strategic petroleum reserves. Will India start filling up? I mean, those are the two to watch for in terms of a demand recovery. Do they now start filling those strategic reserves?
Yeah.
So we're starting to run low on time, so I want to just make sure we get to a few big picture questions before we have to stop. What does all this mean for climate change, the move to renewables? Does it mean that all of that energy and action that was being focused in those areas is now going to be deferred because oil prices are so cheap that it makes renewables look even less attractive from an economic perspective? Or is that no longer the paradigm?
No, I mean, obviously, again, low prices for hydrocarbons undermines the competitiveness with zero carbon energy. We should remember oil doesn't really compete with renewables because oil is used in transportation. Renewables create electricity. So when you see low oil prices, it tends to make, say, electric vehicles less economic. In the United States, at least, and Helima can comment on this, when you're producing a lot less oil, you're also getting less natural gas that actually could slightly increase the price of natural gas. And we see that in the forward prices, which could make renewables a little more competitive. I think, again, this is like a couple of years. We don't know how long this will be where prices collapse and then recover. So I think it's interesting to take sort of a bigger picture view of what the implications could be. And I mentioned one of them earlier, which is my concern that weakness in the economy and the kind of economic pain that we're going to see in the US and elsewhere, especially if this is more than a month or two, which is highly likely to be. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as we think about rebuilding the economy, and we went through this in 2008, 2009 with green stimulus spending in the recovery package. How do we think about investments in the economy to deal with the economic collapse that can pay longer term benefits? And right now, the focus has to be on getting money in people's pockets and helping states and localities. But if this goes on for some period of time, another $1 trillion or $2 trillion mailing checks to people won't be enough. You're going to need the United States to step in and support major industries. We could end up with de facto partial nationalization of parts of the US economy. And that changes how we think about what role there is for government in the auto industry or in the airlines. And how do we think about building those in the longer term? And how do we think about building infrastructure, which can have economic benefits at a time when the cost of capital is so low, and we can borrow pretty cheaply today in order to make investments in the economy that are going to pay off in the long term? Climate is one of, not the only, but one of the important ways to think about that.
Okay, we're really short on time now, so I'm just going to ask you one last rapid question, which is, are there any other big important takeaways we haven't addressed from this last 4 or 5 weeks of unprecedented, crazy turmoil in the energy market?
I mean, I just think from a geopolitical perspective, I mean, one of the issues we've seen with the Russian response in terms of criticism of the sanctions and American energy abundance facilitating a very, very aggressive sanctions policy. I mean, things that were done that we wouldn't have thought was even possible because of the market implications would have been so severe. Think about, exiting the Iranian nuclear deal and ending exemptions for importers of Iranian oil, the type of energy sanctions we put on places like, Venezuela, de facto embargo on Venezuelan barrels coming to the United States. I think going forward will be an interesting question about how do we use the sanctions tool? Is this sort of story about American energy abundance, if we're becoming to sort of question it a little bit, is it going to result in any change in sort of our foreign policy tools that have been enabled by American energy abundance?
So there's a lot of things to say in response to your question. Let me mention one, which is, this is what it means to be energy dominant. Shale is short cycle production. What that means is shale, unlike conventional oil, falls a lot faster and it rises a lot faster. Not as fast as Saudi can open and close the taps, but it falls faster and rises faster. When the US is the largest producer of oil in the world, and I think that's going to continue, we just have to get back to that point. We're going to see when oil prices spike, a huge boom in oil producing regions. And conversely, you're going to see this sort of pain and the broader macroeconomic impact of that. We need to think about what that means for policy and how we think about the school funding and road, the funding for schools and roads in oil producing regions and how they handle this kind of extreme volatility. There are, as I said, a lot of benefits that come with being the largest producer in the world, but especially when you're a short cycle producer, there are some risks and vulnerabilities that we haven't had to think about. And we're seeing those play out with the fact that the president's calling Riyadh and Moscow to ask for higher oil prices. We need to start to think about that side of the equation too, because we probably won't see something as this extreme, hopefully, but it's not the last time we're going to see volatility in oil prices.
Well, on that very interesting note, we're going to stop. I want to just thank everyone who has called in and joined us by Zoom today so much for participating. Thank you for your superb questions. A special thanks to Helima and Helima and Jason. It's not coronavirus, just a problem. We're extraordinary. A recording of this conversation will be available shortly on our website at foreignpolicy.com/live. And I just want to make a plug here. Participation in these calls is usually an exclusive benefit of being an FP insider. On top of weekly calls like this, insiders also get access to products like FP's Power Maps. We just released the latest one of these on how 5G will affect national security. And in 2 weeks on Earth Day, which is I think April 22nd, our FP Analytics team will drop its next special report on climate change and national security, also available exclusively to FP insiders. For more on what you can get with an FP Insider subscription, please visit us at foreignpolicy.com/FP Insider. And of course, since I'm the editor-in-chief, I have to say, go to foreignpolicy.com for all the great content, all the great coverage that we're producing on the coronavirus coverage and everything else that's happening in the world. Meanwhile, I ask you all to please stay safe, stay healthy, don't touch your face, and keep reading. I'm Jonathan Tepperman. Thanks again. Bye-bye.